Okay, we started the axial skeleton past the skull by already introducing the vertebral column. So let's do a quick review, look at our structure list, and then let's fill in some of the more details on this. Notice we have our actual numbers of our vertebrae. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae, numbered C1 through C7, 12 thoracic, numbered T1 through T12, 5 lumbar, numbered from top to bottom, L1 to L5. Then we have our sacrum and our coccyx, which are basically fused vertebrae. All right, and then between each of our actual vertebrae, we have our intervertebral discs. So let's look at that real quick. So we see our numbered vertebrae here, and we also see the what's called the spinal curves. Our vertebrae doesn't just sit directly up and down on top of each other to form a very straight area, but instead it has these natural curves. And so we have the thoracic curves with the 12 thoracic vertebrae in it, the lumbar curve with the lumbar vertebrae, and the sacral curve with both the sacral and coccygeal area of the vertebrae. Let's look again at the structure of a typical vertebrae and make sure we know what all these parts are. So again, these are going to be parts that are going to be found on most vertebrae, almost all of them. So let's again define what these parts are. The main part of any bone is normally called the body. It's usually the largest part of the bone. So here we do see this portion that actually has an intervertebral disc between each body of the vertebrae, this large area, the vertebral body. Then we've actually got this whole region right here, the vertebral arch, and of course that fits around the spinal cord, which runs through the vertebral foramen. Now, this portion that sticks out at you is the spinous process. These portions running to the sides are the transverse processes. But we also have articular processes, which mean they articulate or they come together with another bone. Here we can see that this articular process is articulating with that articular process. So this is the inferior articulating process of this vertebrae, and it's articulating with the superior articulating process of this vertebrae. So again, superior articulating process of any vertebrae is going to be the upper portion, and the inferior articular process are going to be the bottom portion, but they are both going to articulate with the vertebrae either above it, where the superior articular process would articulate, or the vertebrae below it, where the inferior articular process would articulate. Now, another real important distinction that you need to be able to make, because it is actually can be confusing because the names are so similar. You have this area here that the that the spinal cord runs through. As we see this arrow right here, the arrow would represent where the spinal cord is running through the vertebral foramen. But when I put a bunch of these vertebrae together, like they actually are, where they overlap, they form holes on the sides. So whereas this hole is the spinal cord's running through it, on the sides where these overlap, they form what's called intervertebral. Inter means between. So these holes that are between vertebrae, because they're overlapping, this is actually where the spinal nerves would come out of the spinal cord. Spinal cord's running this way, but a spinal nerve would come out this way, would come out this way, would come out this way. So sometimes these discs can actually rupture or herniate, and they can pinch into that intervertebral foramina, or the individual's foramen. But since there's many of them, we say foramina, and that disc can pinch a nerve. So if somebody says, I have a pinched nerve, it's because the spinal cord is running this way, but the spinal nerves are running out of it this direction, and this can actually pinch that spinal nerve when it runs out. So now we know the difference in the intervertebral foramina versus the vertebral foramen. Again, spinal cord runs through this, spinal nerves run out of these. We know our inferior articular processes are where the vertebrae overlap each other. Transverse process to the side. Of course, a spinous process actually sticks out of the back. But what about the other parts of the vertebral arch, the pedicles and lamina? Let's look at that. The pedicles are actually where the arch, the whole thing, attaches to the body. So that's a pedicle there, that's a pedicle there, that's a pedicle here, that's a pedicle here. Now that's tagged as an arch because it's actually referring to the whole thing, but in reality it's just referring, the pedicle is just where the arch attaches. Now if that's the arch, then the lamina is actually where the arch attaches to the spinous process. So here's the spinous process. So this area here, this connective area that connects the spinous process to the rest of the arch is the lamina. So let's look at the different individual vertebrae, the types of vertebrae, first of all, the cervical vertebrae. And of course, what sets them apart is they all have the transverse foramen, the holes on the sides, and those holes actually are for blood vessels. And you'll be learning those when we talk about blood, actually in Bio 142. Okay, but we have some specific vertebrae, again numbered C1 through C7, but C1 and C2 and C7 actually have individual names. We call C1 the Atlas because Atlas was the mythological person who held the world on his shoulders. So your head is the world and C1 holds it on its shoulders. Now this is the one that really lacks a body, so it really is very unique looking. It's flat and wide, and it articulates with your occipital condyles. So this is literally where your head and neck join. So looking at this picture, we can actually see the C1 vertebrae called the atlas, and the body is actually, right back here, which is lacking, but we can see that it does pivot around the C2 vertebrae called the axis. Okay, so the C2 vertebrae is not quite as broad as the C1 vertebrae, but it does have a unique feature that we don't see on any other vertebrae, and it's called the dens or the ondontoid process. So you need to be able to recognize that as either one, the dens or ondontoid process. And of course it's called the axis because in an axis you can usually pivot around an axis. So the C1 literally pivots around the C2, especially there at the dens. Now another thing is, if I look at all of these vertebrae, because they're cervical, there's a transverse foramina, so I would see that on the other side. Here we can see in this picture, I can see a transverse foramina here, transverse foramina there. Now, the C7 vertebrae is our last cervical vertebrae, and it's almost the same size as the T1 vertebrae, but of course the difference is it would actually have the transverse foramina. Now, all of the cervical vertebrae actually have what's called a bifurcate spinous process, or a split in the spinous process. So here's the C5, and it has the most distinguished split right here, and you can kind of see there's a little bit of a split in that one, and even a little bit of a split in the C1. But so from C1 down to C6, we have a little bit of a split, again being the most prominent here in the C5. But C7 does not have that split in the spinous process. It has a much thicker spinous process, very similar to our T1 spinous process. And as a matter of fact, if you feel the back of your neck, that prominent area that you feel kind of sticking out in the back of your neck, it's basically where these two are sticking out in your neck. And of course, they have ligaments kind of tying them together. But that is that prominent area you can feel in the back of your neck. Okay, the thoracic vertebrae, they're T1 through T12, so there are 12 of them. Their main characteristic is that they have rib. This is where ribs attach to areas called costal facets. That would be the main characteristic. But there are some other characteristics that if you just picked up an individual one, you'd pretty much be able to tell it was a thoracic. One thing, it would lack any transverse foramen in it. None of the other vertebrae except for cervical have the transverse foramen, so only 7 vertebrae are going to have that. Okay, but if you see any kind of rib attachment area, I call it a costal facet, you know you have a thoracic vertebrae. But the other thing is, you actually have a long, usually fairly narrow spinous process that always points downward, and you have a heart-shaped body. So let's look at those characteristics. Okay, here is a facet where costal is referring to rib, where a rib would attach, and another rib would actually partially attach to this and probably attach to the one above this one. Okay, so again, rib attachments. The spinous process is long and narrow, pointing downward, giving it almost the appearance of a giraffe. And then if we look at the vertebral body, we can see from this position, the body kind of has a heart shape to it. So not a perfect heart, but a kind of a heart shape to it. Notice, kind of has this little indentation here near the vertebral foramen. So we should be able to tell if we picked up an individual vertebrae, whether it is a thoracic, and then of course we want to be able, if we see the vertebrae together, be able to count down. So we count C1 to C7, and then we'd start at T1 and count all the way down to T12. Our largest vertebrae are going to be our last 5, and they have a thick hatchet-shaped spinous process, and their bodies are going to be increasingly larger. And actually, our spinal cord ends at the superior edge of our L2. So here is a lumbar vertebrae. Notice the thicker spinous process. They call it hatchet shape. Almost gives it like a moose appearance. And of course, no rib facets. And of course, these get larger like all vertebrae do as we go further down. Okay, the sacrum, which is basically formed and fused with 5 vertebrae that are fused, has these parts: the median sacral crest, sacral foramina, sacral canal, and auricular surface. So let's look at that. So we see our sacrum right here, okay? And here we actually see this crest, and of course this is on the posterior side of the sacrum. This is on the anterior side. So on the anterior side we would not see the crest, but on the posterior surface or side we would see the crest. And the crest is kind of covering the sacral canal. And we know remnants of our spinal cord are going to actually extend down through here. And we're even going to have remnants of that spinal cord extending out through here and feathering out into nerves. Okay, now we know that the word foramen means hole, so foramina means many holes. So I hope this makes perfect sense that all these holes here beside the sacral median sacral crest would be the sacral foramina. And then this area here and this area here, if you imagine that this looks kind of like an elephant, and let's say here's the trunk of the elephant down here and here's the head of the elephant, where would the ears of the elephant be? Well, the ears would be over here and over here. And the term auricular, so if I turned that sideways and looked at this big area right here, this would be, auricular means ear-like. So this ear-like surface, and again, if you kind of make this out to look kind of like an elephant, since we're talking about these different animals that our bones look like, then that makes perfect sense. Okay, the coccyx can vary, but it is a fusion of 3 to 5 small, irregularly shaped vertebrae that are attached to the sacrum by ligaments, and these fuse totally by the time you're in your late 20s, early 30s. So you do lose a little bit of flexibility when these fuse together. Here we actually see these vertebrae right here that are fused together, and of course they were attached to the bottom part of the sacrum by a ligament. So again, there's usually a little bit of a bend there. In males, there's actually there's more of a bend in the sacral curve, especially in the coccyx region, than in females. Females, it's straighter. And of course, if you're more curved, you have less room in here. If you're straighter, you have more room in here. So we'll talk more about that room when we talk about the pelvic girdle and the oscoxal bones that would attach to this. So that finishes up the vertebral column. We're still in the axial skeleton. The next video, we will go ahead and finish up the axial skeleton by talking about the bony thorax, the sternum, and the ribs. Then we will start the appendicular skeleton.